Göbekli Tepe was not alone. For 2 decades it sat in textbooks as a singular miracle. A 12,000-year-old temple, built before farming, before pottery, before writing, by people who supposedly couldn't organise at that scale. Then the ground kept talking. More hills, more T-shaped pillars, more buried enclosures, identical in design, scattered across one province. The German Archaeological Institute now calls this a landscape, not a site. Taş Tepeler. Dozens of locations, one shared grammar, no writing anywhere, and not one name carved into any of it, which raises a question nobody has fully answered. Who organised this, and why did they vanish without telling us? For most of the last 20 years, the story of Göbekli Tepe was told as a story about exception. A lone hill in southeastern Turkey, rising out of the Gürmuş Mountains near Şanlıurfa, where German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began digging in 1995 and found something that wasn't supposed to exist yet. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, carved with foxes, scorpions, circling vultures, arranged into deliberate enclosures built roughly 11,500 years ago, before pottery, before metal tools, before agriculture had taken hold anywhere in the region. The accepted timeline said monument building required farming first, surplus food first, settled villages first. Göbekli Tepe didn't wait for any of that, so for 2 decades it sat in documentaries and textbooks as a singular anomaly, a first temple with no obvious successor, no obvious predecessor, no clear explanation for how hunter-gatherers managed to quarry, carve and erect pillars weighing several tons without draft animals, metal chisels, or writing. That framing has not held up. And it started cracking almost as soon as anyone looked seriously beyond the original mound. Excavations across the Şanlıurfa region kept turning up the same thing, over and over, at locations that had no business resembling Göbekli Tepe this closely. Different hills, same pillars, same symbolic grammar, not once, not twice. Repeatedly, until the pattern became impossible to treat as coincidence. Archaeologists working under the German Archaeological Institute, alongside Istanbul University and the Şanlıurfa Archaeology Museum, eventually stopped describing Göbekli Tepe as a standalone site and started describing it as part of something larger, a cultural landscape now known as Taş Tepeler, Turkish for stone hills. Göbekli Tepe was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018, and it had taken that long for even the original mound to receive recognition before the wider landscape forced a far bigger reconsideration of what it actually represented. The name is not poetic shorthand. It's literal. Across the foothills of the Taurus Mountains and the wider Şanlıurfa province, researchers have identified more than a dozen related Neolithic locations, all sharing construction methods, symbolic motifs, and a time frame clustering tightly around the same several centuries. Some are well known, most are still barely excavated. Current fieldwork, coordinated through Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism since 2019, treats these sites not as isolated curiosities studied one at a time, but as nodes in a single connected network, a regional phenomenon, not a one-off miracle. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because an isolated monument can always be explained away as a fluke, one unusually motivated group, one unusually capable leader, one strange convergence of circumstance that never happened again. A network can't be dismissed that easily. A network implies shared knowledge moving between communities. It implies a transmitted architectural language, specific pillar shapes, specific carving techniques, specific symbolic choices, passed from one group to another, deliberately, across real geographic distance. That requires organization. It requires people who could plan, communicate, and coordinate labor across more than a single settlement, season after season, generation after generation. And all of this took place among communities that, by the conventional model, were still hunting and gathering for nearly all of their food. So where exactly does this landscape sit? In a specific, identifiable place, the upper reaches of Mesopotamia, in what is now southeastern Turkey, threaded through the foothills where the Tigris and Euphrates river systems begin their long descent toward the Persian Gulf, low limestone hills, easily quarried, natural mounds that made convenient platforms for building upward and outward. Göbekli Tepe itself sits about 15 kilometers northeast of Şanlıurfa city, on a ridge with sightlines across the surrounding plain, The other Taş Tepeler sites radiate outward from there, some only a short drive apart, others further into the hill country toward the Tek range. None of them was discovered all at once, and none arrived with fanfare. Each one emerged gradually, through separate excavation seasons, separate funding cycles, separate research teams, which is part of why the full shape of this landscape only became clear in pieces, over years, rather than arriving as a single dramatic announcement, and the picture is still incomplete. As of recent survey work, only a small fraction of Göbekli Tepe itself has been excavated. By some estimates, roughly 10% of the total site. Geophysical scanning has identified at least 20 large enclosures still buried beneath the surface, never opened, never studied directly, their contents entirely unknown. If that's true of the most famous, most heavily funded site in the network, how much further from understood are the lesser-known Taş Tepeler locations? Every new excavation season has so far added new structures, new pillars, new symbolic details, not subtracted from the mystery, but expanded it considerably. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014, before the wider network was fully recognised, and the project continued as a joint effort between Istanbul University, the Şanlıurfa Museum, and the German Archaeological Institute, under Turkish prehistorian Necmi Karul. That continuity matters. This isn't one researcher's pet theory aging in isolation. It's an active, multinational, multi-generational excavation program still reshaping its own conclusions year after year. What we're left with, then, is not a settled story, but an active one, still being written field season by field season. A cultural landscape, recognised only recently as a landscape at all, built by communities who left behind extraordinary architecture and almost nothing else. No settlements of comparable scale found nearby. No burial inscriptions naming a builder, a priest, a leader. No tablets, no symbols functioning as writing in any sense scholars can currently decode. Just stone, carved with extraordinary precision and intention by people who organised themselves well enough to move multi-ton blocks across real distances, and who apparently felt no need, or had no available means to record who they actually were. Göbekli Tepe was simply the first piece of this landscape to surface, the one that happened to be found first, named first. It will not be the last piece uncovered here, and it was never the whole picture to begin with. So the deeper the excavation goes, season after season, the more the question itself shifts. It's no longer just who built this one hill. It's who organised an entire region for centuries around an architectural language nobody wrote down and nobody signed. 46 kilometres southeast of Göbekli Tepe, in the Tek Mountains near the village of Kesili, the second major clue surfaced. Karahan Tepe had been noted in earlier regional surveys, but it wasn't until recent excavation seasons that its true scale became clear, and what came out of the ground there did more than confirm Göbekli Tepe wasn't alone. It sharpened the entire pattern, and in some ways complicated it further. The site itself is substantial, roughly 10 hectares of settlement area, with another 5 hectares given over to quarrying, where unfinished pillars still sit half-carved in the bedrock, abandoned mid-process, exactly as their carvers left them thousands of years ago. As of recent survey estimates, only around 5% of Karahan Tepe's total area has been excavated in careful detail. Which raises an obvious question. If this much has already surfaced from 5%, what is still sitting, untouched, in the other 95%? The first thing researchers found was familiar. T-shaped limestone pillars, carved directly into bedrock, or hauled into place exactly as at Göbekli Tepe, arranged inside semi-subterranean chambers cut down into the rock itself. More than 250 individual carved pillars have now been documented at the site, a number that places Karahan Tepe among the densest concentrations of this exact architectural feature anywhere in the Taş Tepeler network, rivaling the original site that gave the whole landscape its name. The earliest structures date to the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, the same broad window as Göbekli Tepe's oldest layers, meaning these two sites were very plausibly active in some form around the same general centuries. Not separated by some vast, unbridgeable span of time. But Karahan Tepe didn't simply repeat Göbekli Tepe, it diverged from it in a way that matters. Where Göbekli Tepe's most famous carvings are dominated by animals, foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes coiling down the pillar shafts, Karahan Tepe's signature discovery centres on the human form, excavators uncovered a rock-cut chamber built around a single carved human head, emerging directly from the bedrock, eyes fixed forward, the rest of the body suggested rather than fully rendered, as though the stone itself were becoming a person. Nearby, researchers found pillars carved with unmistakably human faces, full, deliberate features, not the abstract notches and ridges typical of earlier T-pillar carving elsewhere in the region. One such pillar, dated nearly 12,000 years old, was uncovered during a recent excavation season, and stands as one of the most detailed human representations found anywhere from this period. Why exactly the shift? From animal symbolism toward human imagery, that change has led some researchers to describe Karahan Tepe as a parallel, perhaps later, phase of the same broader tradition, rather than simply a copy of Göbekli Tepe transplanted to a new hill. Whatever the precise relationship between the two sites turns out to be, the underlying grammar connecting them is unmistakable once the evidence sits side by side. And there's another shared detail worth pausing on. Like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe appears to have been deliberately filled in and abandoned at the end of its use, not left to collapse through neglect, not destroyed by catastrophe. Someone made the decision to bury both sites on purpose, and at both sites that decision was never explained, recorded or signed. Stone hills chosen and shaped as platforms, T-shaped pillars, the consistent signature across every major site in the network. Symbolic interior spaces, built not for daily living but for something more deliberate, ritual, gathering, meaning-making. Animal and human imagery, carved with a level of intention that rules out idle decoration. No writing anywhere, at either site, in any form scholars can currently identify or decode. And no names, not of builders, not of leaders, not of whoever decided a human face belonged on that particular pillar in that particular chamber. Two sites, 46 kilometers apart, built by people without metal tools, without draft animals, without a written language of any kind. And yet, the architectural vocabulary lines up closely enough that no archaeologist seriously argues these are unrelated, independent inventions. Shared pillar shapes don't happen by accident twice in the same region within the same few centuries. Shared chamber construction doesn't happen by accident either. A shift from animal-centered to human-centered imagery, occurring within a tradition that otherwise stays remarkably consistent, looks far more like cultural evolution inside a connected network than coincidence. This is where the math becomes harder to wave away. One unusual site can be an anomaly, a fluke, a single brilliant idea that happened once and never spread. Two unusual sites, separated by real distance, sharing this much specific architectural DNA, stop looking like anomalies and start looking like evidence of an actual organizing culture. One capable of transmitting detailed building knowledge across a region, generation after generation, without any of the institutions we'd normally associate with that kind of continuity. No central city has been found connecting them anywhere across the surrounding region. No palace, no administrative archive, nothing resembling the bureaucratic apparatus later civilizations used to coordinate large projects across distance. Just hilltop after hilltop, each one carrying forward the same essential design language with its own local variation layered carefully on top. And still, after two confirmed sites this closely related, the same absence persists at both. Karahan Tepe's builders could carve a human face, with extraordinary precision and care. They could not or did not carve their own name beside it. Whoever organized the labor to cut that chamber into solid bedrock, whoever decided which face deserved to emerge from the stone, which animal belonged on which pillar, left the work behind and walked away from it anonymously. Exactly as the builders of Göbekli Tepe had, decades or centuries worth of construction earlier, less than 50 kilometers up the road. Two sites, one unmistakable grammar, two separate silences where a name should have been, and by the time researchers had documented this much overlap between just these first two locations, it was already clear. Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe were never going to be the whole story. Only the two clearest, best-funded chapters of a much larger landscape still waiting to be read. Two ancient sites would be remarkable on their own. 12 sites across one province is something else entirely. Beyond Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, the Taş Tepeler project, coordinated by Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism and led by Istanbul University prehistorian Necmi Karul, now includes excavations at Sayburç, Sefertepe, Harbetsuvan Tepesi, Çakmaktepe, Gürcütepe, Kurttepesi, Taşlıtepe, Ayyanlar, Yoğunburç, Mendik, and Yeni Mahalle. 11 additional locations, all within the Şanlıurfa Plateau, all dated to roughly the same 11 to 12,000 year window. 9 of them currently have active excavation teams working simultaneously, season after season, year after year. This is no longer a handful of curious outliers scattered loosely across an otherwise empty map. It's the densest known concentration of early Neolithic monumental sites found anywhere on Earth, by a wide margin. Some of these sites carry additional features that hint at just how organised this culture really was. Several locations across the wider regional landscape sit near what researchers call desert kites, long, deliberately constructed dry stone walls, sometimes stretching for hundreds of metres, built to funnel and trap herds of wild game like gazelles. These structures required planning across distances, cooperation between groups, and a long-term understanding of animal behaviour, passed down with enough precision to engineer the landscape itself around it. Whoever built the temples, in other words, was also reshaping the surrounding terrain for entirely practical purposes. Decades before anyone in the region kept domesticated herds, Sayburç offers a different kind of evidence than Göbekli Tepe or Karahan Tepe. Excavations there, led by Eylem Özdoğan since 2021, have uncovered more than 50 Neolithic structures, not just isolated ritual chambers, but an entire settlement where T-shaped pillars appear inside ordinary homes alongside hearths, benches and workspaces, not only inside grand ceremonial enclosures. That distinction matters. It tells researchers the symbolic system behind the pillars wasn't confined to a priestly elite operating apart from daily life. It was woven into how people actually lived, day to day, for roughly 3 uninterrupted centuries at that one location alone. The same pillar tradition present in both the homes and the gathering spaces. At Sefertepe, recent seasons have turned up newly carved face reliefs, rendered in styles distinct enough from Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe that researchers can already see local variation branching off from the shared tradition. At Karahan Tepe itself, more recent excavations uncovered the largest known human statue from this period anywhere in the world, a seated figure over 2 meters tall carved with visible ribs, spine and shoulder bones, evoking the dead while somehow still posed like the living. Excavators have also reported a sealed-mouth statue elsewhere in the network, widely interpreted as representing death or some kind of ritual transition, along with a small black serpentine bead carved with a double-faced human motif. A tiny, deliberate object that took real skill to produce, and that, like everything else here, arrived without any explanation of what it meant to whoever carved it. The same underlying grammar shows up at every new site, again and again. Stone hills selected and shaped as platforms, T-shaped pillars as the consistent signature, symbolic interior spaces built for gathering rather than daily survival, animal and human imagery carved with obvious intention, no writing in any form, no names attached to any of it. The current excavation effort itself is unprecedented in scale. Researchers report roughly 219 academics now working across these sites, including teams from the United Kingdom, Germany and Japan, alongside Turkish institutions, an international research operation large enough to open multiple settlements simultaneously, rather than working through them one at a time across decades the way earlier archaeology typically had to. That approach has compressed what might once have taken half a century of slow, sequential digging into a single connected, well-funded research program, and the picture it's producing keeps getting larger, not smaller, with each new field season that passes. So what's actually emerging here? Not a single temple, not even a pair of related temples standing alone in the hills. A regional civilization-scale phenomenon, a network of communities spread across a real landscape, sharing belief systems, construction techniques, and symbolic vocabulary, organizing labor on a scale that required real planning and real continuity across many generations of people who never met one another. And at every single one of these 11 additional sites the same essential absence holds. No tablets, no inscriptions, no royal names, no builder's mark, no symbol functioning as a signature anywhere in the entire network. This is the part that should sit uncomfortably, not because it implies anything sinister was hidden, but because it's simply, plainly strange once you sit with it for more than a moment. We know these people could plan multi-year construction projects. We know they could move multi-ton stone blocks without draft animals, using nothing but human labour, rope, and timber levers. We know they could coordinate that labour across more than a dozen separate locations, consistently enough to produce a shared architectural language recognisable from one hilltop to the next, decades and even centuries apart. We know they could carve extraordinarily specific intentional imagery, animals chosen for symbolic reasons, human faces rendered with individual character, bodies posed to suggest very particular meanings that still aren't fully understood. All of that requires memory, transmission, and organisation sophisticated enough to rival anything we'd normally associate with early civilization, written records or not. So how does a culture capable of all that leave behind nothing resembling a name? Not a builder's name, not a leader's name, not even a settlement's original name in the people's own words. Every name we use today, Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Sayburç, Sefertepe, Taş Tepeler itself, is a label applied by modern researchers in modern Turkish to places whose original inhabitants left no record of what they called themselves, their gods, or their dead. What language did they speak? Did all 12 sites share one language, or several related dialects? Did the carved faces represent ancestors, gods, spirits, or something else entirely that doesn't map onto any category we currently have words for? Every interpretation offered by archaeologists today, however well-reasoned, is still an outside guess looking in at a closed system from 12,000 years downstream. An organised civilization scattered across an entire region, building with astonishing intention for centuries, and utterly completely anonymous to the people who would eventually come looking for them 12,000 years later. None of this stays buried in the Neolithic, sealed off in one small corner of southeastern Türkiye forever. Several thousand years after the last pillar at Taş Tepeler was carved, buried and abandoned, writing finally arrives in the same broader region, not at these hilltop sites themselves, but further south and east, down in the river valleys of Sumer, where the Tigris and Euphrates finally settle into the flat alluvial plain. And when the Sumerians started pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, one of the very first things they chose to preserve was a memory of a world that existed before their own world began. Why start there? Why, with an entirely new technology for recording anything at all, begin by reaching backward instead of forward? The Sumerian king list opens with a strange, almost mythic line. Kingship descended from heaven and was first established in the city of Eridu, considered by some archaeologists to be the oldest city in Mesopotamia. It then names 8 rulers who reigned before a great flood arrived and changed everything, with reign lengths so enormous, measured in the thousands of years, using the Sumerians' own base 60 counting system, that no literal chronology makes sense of them today. Alongside these antediluvian kings, other texts describe 7 sages, the Apkallu, sent by the god Ea, also known as Enki, to teach humanity the foundational arts of civilization, writing, building, agriculture, craft. One of them, Uana, was said to emerge from the waters of the Persian Gulf each day to instruct people directly, then return to the deep each night, gone again before anyone could ask where he had truly come from. After the flood, the texts insist, wisdom passed from these divine teachers to ordinary human scholars, and the world as the Sumerians knew it properly began, with named kings ruling named cities for ordinary, believable lengths of time. So does that solve Taş Tepeler once and for all? No, not even close. It would be easy and wrong to draw a straight line from that story to Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and call the mystery closed. There is no archaeological evidence that the Sumerians knew anything specific about the stone hills. No tablet referencing builders in the Tek Mountains. No inscription naming a vanished people to their north. The geographic and chronological gap between the last confirmed Taş Tepeler construction and the earliest Sumerian writing is real, substantial, and shouldn't be flattened for the sake of a tidier story. What connects them isn't evidence of contact. It's something quieter, a shared shape to how 2 cultures separately handled the same unsettling problem. What came before us, and how do we carry it forward? Because look at what each side actually preserved. The Sumerians wrote down names, kings, sages, reign lengths, a precise sense that their civilization had been built on a foundation laid by named, or at least nameable, figures before them however legendary those figures eventually became. Names like Wana survived for thousands of years, copied tablet to tablet by generations of scribes, because writing existed to carry them forward. The Taş Tepeler builders left something almost opposite: extraordinary architecture, carved with the same intention and care a king's name might receive elsewhere, attached to no name at all. One culture preserved memory without monuments anyone has found. The other preserved monuments without any memory we can read. Between them sits the same basic problem, approached from two directions. How do you carry forward the truth of who came before you, when so much of that truth depends on whether anyone wrote it down in time? The Sumerians clearly believed something had been lost or transformed by the flood that divided their antediluvian kings from their historical ones. They built an entire literary tradition around that division, a before and an after, a world of sages and impossibly long reigns giving way to a recognizably human one. Whether that division corresponds to any real event is a separate question, and not one these architectural sites can answer. But the instinct behind the story, that something older and stranger preceded the world you actually live in, and that it deserves remembering even imperfectly, is the same instinct that should make Taş Tepeler difficult to look away from. Because here, the builders never got their Wana. No sage's name attached itself to Göbekli Tepe's vultures, or Karahan Tepe's carved human face. No king list assigned a name and a reign length to whoever decided a particular pillar deserved a particular animal, or whoever organized the labor to bury an entire sacred complex once its use had ended. The Sumerians, writing thousands of years later in a different language entirely, still found a way to gesture backward at a world before their own, and give it names, however mythologized those names became with retelling. The Stone Hills builders left no equivalent gesture, or none that survives in any form we currently know how to read. What they left instead was the architecture itself: stone hills, T-shaped pillars, symbolic chambers, animal and human imagery, repeated across more than a dozen sites in one province, for a span of centuries long enough to qualify as a civilization in everything but name. Everything but name. So what does that leave us with? Göbekli Tepe was not alone. It never was, and it never should have been treated as a singular, isolated miracle in the first place. It was one carved hilltop in a landscape of carved hilltops, built by an organized, capable, far-reaching culture that left behind some of the most sophisticated monumental architecture anywhere from this period in human history, and never once told us, in any language we can decode, who they actually were. The Sumerians, centuries downstream, found a way to name what came before them, even mythically, even imperfectly, even by attributing it to gods and fish-cloaked sages rather than ordinary people. The builders of the stone hills did not, or could not, or simply never needed to. Their names are simply gone now, the way an entire vocabulary can disappear while the stone it was carved onto somehow survives. What's left now is the architecture, waiting in the ground exactly where it's been waiting for 12,000 years, still being uncovered one careful excavation season at a time, still without a single name attached to any of it.